Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Restoring the Soul podcast. I'm Michael John Cusick. Today, my guest is Jay Stringer. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Michael. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, thank you. Last time it was a new introduction, at least face-to-face. We'd interacted a little bit before that. I'm going to hold up the book right away. It is, for those that are watching on YouTube, Desire. Subtitle, I'm sorry, I have to check out the subtitle. My false self wanted to be able to say it, just smoothly, but it's a great subtitle, but it's long. Desire, the longings inside of us and the new science of how we love, heal, and grow. This book really is about...
And that subtitle has had so many iterations to it that you could almost say anything and I would believe you.
Yeah. Desire.
Our 5 core longings.
We won't go there.
Yes.
But the word desire does make me think of the scene from Princess Bride when the bishop comes out with the mitre on his head and he says, "Marriage." And I just hear the word desire. I don't know why that popped in my head right now.
That would be great if we could just open up the book and have Michael say that upon reading it.
Great. The new
maybe in the Audible version
thing.
We could do that.
Yeah. Right. This is not part 2. This is actually a brand new conversation about probably 8 weeks out from when we talked last time. And there were 3 sections of your book that we never got to. And those sections about desire had to do with intimacy, pleasure, and meaning. If you'll review the 5 core desires, those are 3 of them, but we camped out on the first 2. What are those first 2?
So the first 2 are a desire for wholeness, and then the second is a desire for personal growth. So wholeness is about, do you desire to know your story, to heal some of those formative wounds that have marked your life? Do you know where you come from? And then that builds upon that to a desire for personal growth. And so part of the nuance there is that I think we're in a day and age where there's a lot of desire for personal growth and optimization and getting your life into a lot of protocols and, getting sunlight, getting your steps in. But if you don't know where you come from, I think a lot of personal growth these days looks like a level of mastery over your life. And I think that there's something about that desire for mastery that we're seeing in our world that is much more to do with a trauma response. So when we come out of a, family of origin that had intimidation, aggression, deprivation, you need to find something reliable, to find soothing, to find someone that sees you, to find some level of competence in your life. And so in the absence of good care and good connection, I think that there's something about protocols and mastery that can become something of that, I want to bypass my story and just kind of begin to feel solid ground underneath me. And so part of what I'm trying to develop in that section is how do we develop a radical hospitality to the difficulties that have marked our life? Like, are we kind to those places where we are absolutely underdeveloped? But then the nuance of where are you burdening other people with your need for validation and kind of just going through life pining for attention or sight? Those are all markers that you kind of lack differentiation. So if you don't have differentiation, you don't know who you are, you don't like who you are, that will bring you into intimacy with something of a laundry list of needs that you want your friends and significant others to meet in your life.
Well, we could stop right there and just unpack all of that, because some of that is fresh. The phrase we unpacked last time was that radical hospitality to yourself, or the generous hospitality. And in that conversation, for those who have not listened to my first conversation with Jay, go back and listen to that. One of the things I especially appreciated, completely unexpected, not that I thought you were perfect, but you really opened up and were quite vulnerable about your own story, especially as it relates to food and compulsive eating. That's something something that I could very much relate to. So my question around this word mastery, we both have been profoundly influenced and studied under Dr. Dan Allender, the legend. And he used to talk about addictions as mastery addictions or absorption addictions, or where you get
That's right.
lost in something.
Yeah.
So there's an aspect of mastery that we're actually created for mastery, for competence, and to have a confidence. But you're referring to mastery that's more about control, an
Mm-hmm.
unhealthy control, that I'm going to hack my life and control it so that I'll either become this lovable person or so that the outcome will somehow give me a kind of security. Am I getting that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep. I forgot about those distinctions, but those are great. The absorptive addictions versus those of mastery. And so part of, one of the stories that I always think about in this particular realm is I had a client come into a session one day and she was just kind of on her lunch break, came in gloriously sweaty. But essentially what she told me is, just went for a run. And I said, how'd the run go? And she said, I crushed it. And I said, what does crushing mean? Like, I'm a therapist. I'm paid to be hypervigilant about word choices. And so I just said, like, I have a sense of what crushed means, but tell me what crushed means to you. And she essentially said, if I run 8 miles in under an hour, that's how I know that I've kind of crushed a workout. And asking her, like, okay, so let's say you run 6 miles. Let's say you run 5 miles. What do you feel? And she said something along the lines of, like, I don't really feel strong. I don't really, I might feel more shame. And, whenever people are initially talking about shame, they want to fly over that story at 20, 30,000 feet. So it wasn't just shame about her body if she wasn't, running a lot. I asked her kind of, what are some of the particulars of where you will feel shame? She thought for a couple seconds and then essentially said that she feels shame in her thighs if she does not run 8 miles. So again, that opens up the door to a lot of stories of what has been the war with regard to your thighs. And she brought me back into a childhood memory where her mom said to her, women in this side of the family have very thick thighs. You're going to have to work out throughout a lot of your life. So for her, this running, this commitment to develop mastery over a particular number of miles within a particular number of minutes was a trauma response, that there was an unreasonable hospitality. There wasn't grief or anger about what her mom was setting up for her. It was a sense of mastery so that I do not have to feel shame. I don't have to feel my own vulnerability. And I think that's what I see happening quite a bit in our world today, is that we don't like who we are. We might feel vulnerable. We might feel weak. But then if we can optimize our life, if we can do all the things, get all the right meds, get all the right regimens in, then we can try and feel at home in our bodies and in our souls. And yet there's something in us that knows that we are over-indexing in good things, but really not really paying attention to our soul, to our story in the process.
So let me ask you this question about loving ourselves, because you've referred several times to not liking ourselves. I think I know how you would respond to this. I have this sense that many therapists do, that if we don't love ourselves, that we can't really love others. And recently I was going through the social media platform of a hyper conservative female commentator who, her whole episode was that if you wait to love yourself before you love others, that you'll never get there. So we just need to decide to love others. It's a choice. There was a book years ago called Love is a Decision. And she gave such compelling Bible verses that I found myself, despite my stance on that, going like, geez, I need to reevaluate that. And I need to understand the Greek and the Hebrew. But comment on this idea of liking ourselves, self-acceptance, compassion toward ourselves, gentleness, patience toward ourselves, why that's essential to be able to love in a way that actually is kind of flow instead of just flexing our muscles.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And I wonder if part of us as therapists are more predisposed to those that to the answer that we need to first kind of love ourselves in order to love others really well. There could be something in the therapist's makeup of kind of how our unique wounding works there. But yeah, I find that all the time, that there's a sense of, raising kids for me has been a cornering process of, when I was growing up, I used to have this like Atlanta Braves t-shirt regiment, and I wore a t-shirt, Atlanta Braves t-shirts almost every day of the week. And then eventually this kid said, Jay, you should probably have your mom take you shopping and get some Tommy Hilfiger, some Rusty shirts, some Stussy. Like, you could really use a wardrobe upgrade. And hadn't thought much about that story, but when you look at me throughout all of high school, I'm wearing collared shirts. That Atlanta Braves baseball is just gone. So that sense of being a pastor's kid, image management is really core to me. So now I'm I'm fathering a teenager, and my son loves kind of New York Knicks wear and, has his favorite sweatshirt that he wants to wear virtually every day of the winter. And so I have all of this kind of unaddressed baggage of like, you're going to be made fun of. You need to manage your image. What are, your leaders thinking? What are your teachers thinking? What are your classmates thinking? I'm trying to manage him. And I think part of that sense is I'm not loving my son well. So I'm needing to go back to my 10-year-old self, 12-year-old self to kind of say, like, what was that level of mockery? What was I going through? And so I think when I understood something of my story and understood where I came from and what I was navigating, that really helped me to love my son well, which was basically to not meddle in his fashion choices. So I think that happens. But we also know from the neuroscience that, the more attentive you are to your own grief, your own trauma, the gray matter in your brain is going to shift, which then allows you to have more empathy towards the needs of others because you first recognize it in yourself. And so when I was going through grad school, we used to have a professor that was always talking about like, it doesn't matter if you're dealing with schizophrenia, if you're dealing with illegal behavior, you have to learn how to identify that part of yourself before you can do really good work, because there is a certain rationale to why people function the way that they do. So I think that's part of how I've trained, is that I need to recognize it in myself first, recognize my own wounds. But I do think, to nuance that, I think there is a time and a space to figure out like, okay, maybe I don't know where this is in my own story, but I'm still called to love. I'm still called to give something, and someone better than I have deserved. And what I find in doing that is that when I try and commit to loving my wife well, even when I don't feel like there's a level of deserve there, or I feel like, okay, like there's a certain friendship that I'm reaching out to them so much more than they are reaching out to me. When I move towards that, part of what opens up in me is that sense of grief and loss of like, I'm loving better than I have been loved. And that creates some level of tears, some level of grief, which I think opens and changes me to connect to some of these places in my life that I have longed for so much more connection, and yet that connection has not come. So, I think the most reliable path is to identify your own story and vulnerabilities and grief and glory. But I think there's still a call to love. And when you move towards an honor to love others, I think that opens up your heart to more grief, but also more love. So
yeah,
I think it's all of it.
Yeah, I love that. And certainly not loving yourself, because I've struggled with self-hatred for decades that directly comes out of my own story, and I've experienced some significant healing there, but that's never an excuse for not loving or for a lack of kindness. And maybe a way of thinking about it is not, do we have to love ourselves first, and is it possible to love others? But shame, which is in effect all the forms of not liking yourself and self-rejection, self-loathing, that's a barrier, and it always creates distance. So if you're loving out of shame, you may be able to fill the person's cup or whatever the moment is, but you can't sustain that because there's a distance to it.
Yeah, that's what you see a lot with the Enneagram 2s, where it's like you develop this provisional identity
Jay,
around. Yes.
I'm an Enneagram 2. We're not going to go there. All right. So I'm sorry. Let's move on.
We'll cut it off.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
That sense of the Enneagram 2, there's a provisional self when you're not in health with that. So there's this sense of like my worth, my understanding, my self-soothing, going back to that level of mastery and grounding. The more that I love other people, the more that I can kind of feel like I have an identity, I have a place in life. And so that's part of, the work is when you stop and outgrow something of that identity, you're going to have all these swirling feelings of, will people want me? What's my purpose? What's my need? How do I get through life? And I think that's what a lot of us tend to avoid is that crucible of growth. So we all have provisional self. You might have your Enneagram 2. I have my Enneagram 3, which is, a lot of image management. And when I begin to let that go, then there's so much confusion. There's so much, just a sense of, I don't know where to go if I don't go back to this default identity. And so I think that's all the personal growth stuff is, will you actually desire for your provisional identity to eventually fade into the sunset so that something new, something authentic might be able to emerge. And, just even in the last couple years of being in a midlife crisis, as a pastor's kid, a lot of my desire was about being good. It was about being a golden child. It was about knowing the theological commentaries, knowing the language, being a good therapist. But as that begins to recede a bit, part of what I feel come to me is if I don't have to be good, then I can actually be creative. And so, even the last couple months, the less that I've been trying to be good for people, the less I've been trying to be a therapist to all people at all times, the more longing there is to express things, to discover things, to document things. Like I want sketchbooks, I want journals, I want so much stuff around me because I'm not living into that provisional identity of needing to be good for other people to be able to offer a surrogate sense of soothing in my life.
I love that. So where do 3s go in health? I know as a 2, I go to 4. Where do you go?
I don't know. This is where my Enneagram knowledge, I knew at one point, but I could not tell you.
Okay.
At this point.
If this were a live program,
I feel like I can see. Yeah.
If someone knows
I know
the
you
answer
have
to
some
that
friends
question,
that could help us.
yeah, I could call Ian up right now and he could answer. But if someone knows the answer to that question right now, call 1-800-253-5961. That's 1-800-253-5961. That's the Restoring the Soul line. That's actually not. When I was a kid, that was the number to WMMS, the radio station that brought rock and roll to Cleveland and led the rock and roll museum there. So you can't call if you're listening. It's not a real number. But whatever that line is. I could look
it up right now, but I feel like I can see the arrow at some point in my life. But I feel like
we know that
down.
it gets better. When we're in health, it gets better. When I go to the Enneagram 4, I like to say that I pick up my guitar and I start writing poetry. And I have a guitar that hangs on the wall and I can kind of gauge my mood and where I'm in, health or stress, based on it feels like effort and I don't want to go there versus that I do pick it up and, okay, that's a good sign.
And do you sing? Are they other songs? Do you write?
I write songs. I've recorded just a little bit. It's been a number of years, but write poetry and I just like to sometimes just do scales. There's just something about hearing the sound and the focus. It's very self-soothing.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What if healing didn't have to take years? Hey friends, it's Michael. At Restoring the Soul, we guide men, women, and couples through intensive counseling that brings deep transformation, often in just a few weeks. And our mission is fueled by generous people like you. Now you can become a monthly partner by setting up a recurring donation of any amount. If you give $20 or more on a monthly basis, I'll send you a signed copy of my book, Sacred Attachment. To set up a monthly gift, visit restoringthesoul.com and click donate. Make sure in the notes section to type the word book. Thanks for helping to restore lives.
I'm curious, it obviously could be a very sacred dimension of your life, but like, do you find yourself I'm curious, like how you find your poetry, your songwriting. What do you write versus when you write for an audience? Like, are they similar or are they
No,
different?
it's very different, and it comes back to that word creativity, where something flows. The way that I write is I have hundreds of Post-it notes and scraps of paper from morning journaling, and then I dictate a lot, and I transcribe talks, and then I have an editor kind of take it to the next stage. My longtime friend, Dudley Delfs, who went through the counseling program with me at CCU, he was never called to be a therapist, so he got a PhD in creative writing. So we've collaborated for a while. He's also part of our men's weekend. Should you ever come to that, I'd love for you to meet him. So it feels freer. It feels lighter. It feels like there's something inside of me that needs to be birthed, as opposed to there's something in me that I have to accomplish. I mean, it's very hard if you're writing nonfiction, right? To write nonfiction in a way that feels like it's flowing, because you're crafting something. But then there's also that aspect of the stuff we write. We're pretty much thinking about it all the time, unless we're intentionally shutting it off. But it's a great question. Hey, I want to move on to the other three desires. You mentioned the first one and the second one, wholeness and growth. The three that we didn't touch on, once again, were pleasure, intimacy, and meaning. And let's start with pleasure, even though in the book, intimacy was preceded pleasure, I believe, because maybe we'll need to talk about self-regulation after we talk about pleasure, because not all of it, but a big chunk of pleasure was sexuality. Let's start with the obvious. That is, we live in a culture and a world and a time that is obsessed with pleasure and yet so little satisfaction. So talk about why you included pleasure as one of our core desires.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that we are made for pleasure. We are made in the image of God, who finds so much pleasure in connection, in intimacy, in the flight of an eagle, in creation. And so, part of where I'm going with regard to pleasure is that pleasure is not just something that's completely confined to the realm of sexuality. Pleasure is something that we are made for. And in many ways, it is our birthright. And so oftentimes what ends up happening is that people will pursue different pleasures. They pursue orgasm. They pursue Michelin-starred restaurants. They pursue luxury travel. And at the end of the road, they often feel like that sense of, this doesn't satisfy me, or everything that I have wanted and I have pursued keeps falling through my fingers, and I don't understand why. Well, I think part of where I'm trying to build is that sometimes if you don't have a fully developed sense of self, if you don't have, deep connections of kind of deep vulnerability with other people, there's something about pleasure that will never fully satisfy. And so in that realm of a desire for pleasure, part of what I'm talking about with regard to sex is that, sex is the great revealer of where we come from. It provokes us and it has the power to potentially heal us. But I think most people don't like the revelations that come up for them with regard to their sexual life. We don't like to be provoked beyond our window of tolerance. And for those reasons, we don't really get towards a sexual pleasure that has the power to heal us. And so I think part of what we need to desire is, how do I desire the revelation of sex? How do I desire the provocation of, sex and intimacy are always going to push me to grow beyond my current window of tolerance. But most of us try to use sex and intimacy to escape those difficulties rather than move through them. So an example would be, let's say that there is this man, and write about, this case example in the book, but one of the things he was dealing with was just a sense of premature ejaculation, that every time he got together with his partner, he felt like a failure. And so what he said is that every time he had intimacy with his wife, he would feel some level of a voice inside of him berating him to not finish too soon, to pleasure his wife, to not fail. And so part of what we started working through is that that's actually revealing some unaddressed aspect of his life. And the story that he began to tell was having a father at some of his sporting events who was always just yelling at him, like, protect the plate in baseball. When he was playing basketball, his dad was always yelling at him to box out. And so, basically what he learned is that when he did well, his father was waiting for him after the games. But anytime he failed, had an error, struck out a couple times, missed like more than 2 or 3 free throws, his dad would just desert him and leave him. And so what he started realizing is that part of what sex was revealing to him is that he has this father's voice inside of him that's constantly berating him. And he has these metrics of success or failure that are really ruining so much of his life. So sex was the great revealer of a truth that he had not been able to see before. And I think that's what happens a lot, whether it's an unwanted sexual behavior of, something like pornography, infidelity, or just a place of sexual anxiety or a level of hypoarousal, meaning I don't have any desire for sexuality. That is revealing some really core fundamental truths about the relationship or about your own individual life. And so, a lot there, but how do we desire the revelations of where we feel like sexually inadequate or that we have failed?
That's so powerful. I know that you're familiar with the work of David Snarch, who was right here in Evergreen, Colorado, and wrote the book Passionate Marriage. And he talks about the word you used earlier about crucible. And so this idea of revelation is that not just in sexual intimacy, but really in the pursuit of any pleasure, whether that is Michelin star restaurants or pornography, that too becomes a revelation. And you've been known as the desire whisperer or the fetish whisperer, where you've written about in your book Unwanted that what we desire actually reflects back something of our heart's longings and something of our story. So say a little bit about that before we move on from revelation to provocation.
Yeah, so this is taken from, I first heard about this concept from the French psychoanalyst by the name of Lacan. And so for Lacan would say that every person has a symptom. And in French, if you know it, Michael, let me know. I think it's symptôme. But he said that every symptom is a saintome, and saintome in the French is holy man. So for Lacan, every symptom of your life, those unwanted fantasies, depression, anxiety, conflict in your marriage, those are the holy prophets that are trying to get your attention. But most of us do not like holy prophets. We shoot them, we annihilate them. Most of the time we want medication for our symptoms. We want a gin and tonic for our symptoms. We don't really try to listen. And so part of what I was doing with Unwanted and within Desire is how do we learn how to develop a desire to listen to the holy prophets in our life. And so all of us are going to face some level of sexual shame or struggle. It could be a sense of our own pornography use. It could be a sense of just feeling no sexual desire. It could be just being in a marriage where it feels like, okay, I'm the only one who holds desire. I'm never desired by my partner. And there's a certain heartache. There's a certain woundedness that comes in us. So how do we understand that these symptoms, these difficulties are trying to get our attention? So in the realm of pornography, part of what our research showed is that we could begin to predict not just how much porn men and women watch, but far more the particularities of their porn use. So, we could begin to predict what they put into Pornhub, what they put into Google. And that was how we knew we had kind of struck a nerve, is that people developed a lot of curiosity for, like, why am I drawn to this fetish? Why am I drawn to this particular sexual fantasy? So I think this was from Patrick Carnes, but it could have been from anyone. But there is the line in Harry Potter series where Harry looks into the mirror of Erised, if you've read the book or seen the movie, and what Harry Potter, the orphan, sees reflected back to him is his parents. And so he is an orphan. And so the way that J.K. Rowling wrote Erised is that that's actually desire spelled backwards. So whenever the person looks into the mirror of Erised, what's reflected back to them is their most ardent longing or wish. And so I think that's a really good exercise, that if you were to look into the mirror of Erised, desire spelled backward, what would that image be that would be reflected back to you? And instead of hating what's revealed in that, instead of hating your desire or endlessly chasing it, can you develop a healthy and kind interrogation for, I wonder why this is the image. I wonder why this is the archetype. I wonder why this is the symbol that is reflected back to me. And, throughout different seasons of our life, that Erised is going to reflect back many different things. I know I'm in my 40s now, and my mirror of Erised is very different than it was in my 20s or my 30s. So we have to kind of recognize that our desires are going to shift and change. And not every desire needs to be chased, but not every desire needs to be suppressed and pathologized either. We need to learn how to listen to what our desires are trying to tell us.
Yeah, your line that I quote all the time in Unwanted is listen to your lust. We could say, outside of the sexual realm, listen to your longings and just simply listen to your desire. So if I'm getting this right, tell me your story, tell me your longings, and as we walk together, I'm going to be able to predict what it is that you're drawn to and possibly what you're addicted to. That's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And what is glorious about you? I think that's the beauty of this work, is I'll be able to kind of begin to predict the heartaches, the traumas, the addictions in your life, but I'll also be able to begin to imagine what redemption, what glory would begin to look like. And I need to memorize this line from C.S. Lewis, but that sense of, if we could behold the marvel of who someone would one day be, we would be tempted to fall on our knees and worship them. Or if we could see the horror of what we would become, essentially we would run away as if it was a horror. And I think all of us have that potential. Our desires can move us into the most horrific version of ourselves. Our desires can also move us into the most beautiful, stunning version of ourselves. And that's often where the work of evil and the work of the gospel vie for the human heart.
Say that again. The work of evil and the work of the gospel, therefore the Trinity, is to vie for the human heart. I think that'll be a new thought for some people, that God's work is not just to get us into heaven, but to really capture our heart, and that evil is right there trying to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. If evil is out to destroy the glory of God, which it can't, it will go after that which most reflects God's glory, which is men and women. It's our gender. It's our longings. It's what the God of the universe has put inside of us. And so I think there is going to be that sense of God is seducing us to beauty, to goodness, to truth, to what it means to be formed in the image and likeness of God, to be, desiring community, to be part of the church, to be part of the people of God. But at the same time, evil wants to kill, it wants to steal, it wants to destroy those desires. So I think there's always this sense of vying to seduce us to things that degrade beauty, to things that begin to make us feel that our worth is not in our belovedness, but it's in our ability to accomplish something or to love someone else well. And so I think part of what the gospel is always inviting us into is this sense of like, you are beloved, you are beautiful. Will you wake up to that? That there is a Father who waits for us. There's a Father who, in the words of Allender, repentance is turning to the party that God is throwing in your honor. That's what it means to wait, to recognize that God wants to party with us, that wants our beauty, wants good food, good drink for us. At the same time, I think evil is really trying to move us towards the degradation of desire, towards the selfishness of desire, so that when we look at the desires that have marked our life or the desires of others, we see that they have brought in a lot of heartache or a lot of cruelty.
Good segue to intimacy, because we're already talking about this, and I love how your chapters and the sections of the 5 core desires weave into each other. But you talked about the transformational possibilities of intimacy, and intimacy being one of the core desires. So just for those that were intrigued or nudged by what we're talking about with pleasure and the revelation, provocation, and healing that can come from that, just talk about the bigger idea of the possibility of transformation. And so I'm remembering this quote, and I cannot remember the author's name either. I should memorize the author's name. But he said that marriage is the last best opportunity to grow up.
Yeah, so this was, I think this was part of what I started grappling with after Unwanted was, I could outgrow a paradigm like unwanted sexual behavior. I could help clients understand, see their shame from a very different standpoint, help them to grow, but they were still returning back to the same marriages. They were still, very underdeveloped in that capacity of giving and receiving love. And then what they would do is they would often blame the marriage rather than recognize that they are profoundly underdeveloped in love. So much of our work as therapists, and if you are a client, it's the invitation to see like, Dan Siegel's great 4 S's of seen, safe, soothed, and secure. Very likely you lacked a sufficient amount of those 4 S's. And so another way of saying that is that your home was underdeveloped in intimacy. And then you become an adult and you arrive at that stage of marriage. And then you realize I'm very selfish. My spouse is very selfish. We are very underdeveloped in intimacy. But just because you've understood your story and you grieve some of that does not mean that you are developing the skill of learning how to give and receive love. And so, this is what I think marriage and friendship are always doing is exposing where we are underdeveloped. So a lot of times people get to the stage, get to the terrain of intimacy, and they're like, this marriage sucks. I don't want to be in this marriage anymore. I need to leave it. And part of what I would say to a client in that situation is, yeah, maybe if there's divorce, if there's infidelity, if there's some things that we need to look at, but is it possible that your marriage is actually doing exactly what marriage is designed to do, which is to show you and your partner and your relationship where it needs to grow in order to have a greater capacity to give and receive love. And so, some of the most difficult years of my marriage, I blamed my wife quite a bit rather than recognizing that my marriage was working very well to show where my provisional self was, where a lot of my anger and unaddressed anger was, a lot of the dimensions in her life that she needed to confront. And so many of us move very quickly into my friendships are broken, my marriage is broken. And part of what I want to say is, no, your relationships are probably working very, very well to reveal the exact places and the particularities that await your level of integrity. So that's part of intimacy, is I think all of us are underdeveloped. And in that Schnarchian language of crucible, we all have to go through the crucible of marriage or the crucible of relationships in order to see where we need to grow.
And now I'm not keeping my own order, but fast forwarding to, the very end of the book. And you talk about three pillars. And I want you to unpack this more later, but one of them was, remember that life comes through death. And that's really what we're talking about. To say it in a, I won't say fundamentalist way, because it's actually probably true for mystics as well, but that marriage is really an opportunity to die so that you can actually become and live the life that God created you to live.
Yes. Yeah. That notion of life comes through death. I mean, I think to me, that's so central to what it means to live as a Christian, is, that we live, with the recognition that there is Good Friday, there is trauma, there is loss, there is sexual abuse, there is heartache. And then Saturday is that sense of Holy Saturday, which the church has not had ever a robust theology of, but it's absence. And then obviously Sunday, day of resurrection, day of, death does not have the last word, and we celebrate and we rejoice in that. But all of us live in that tension between death and resurrection. And I used to think that, being a good Christian was about having a dogmatic story of redemption for every bad thing that had happened. Like, I could talk about trauma a little bit if I could tell a Sunday story of this is, how evil meant it, but this is what God meant, something for good. I could tell that story, but lingering in Good Friday, lingering in death was like, nope, I am not going to have a good window of tolerance for Friday or Saturday. I need to move towards Sunday. Yeah. And so that's part of what I think marriage is doing such an exceptional job about, is you can't just move your marriage into a place of health. You can't just move it into I'm going to do a conference, I'm going to do a retreat, and then all of a sudden I'm going to start desiring my spouse. There's so much stuff that needs to be undone. So one of the core realities for me was, I grew up meeting a lot of the needs of my own mom. I had a sixth sense for the needs of what women were going through. And then it became this place of, I'm going to suppress my needs. But in the context of romantic relationships, I felt this intense desire gone mad to be seen, to be enjoyed, to have those 4 S's that were never given to me in my childhood. And that sense of the desire becoming a demand to be filled is part of, that's the nature of lust, is I didn't have something and now I need it. And so part of what marriage began to expose was a lot of my unaddressed anger, a lot of my unaddressed entitlement. And part of what I was doing in my marriage was bringing a laundry list of unmet needs and a lot of entitlement. But then I really wanted my wife to desire me sexually and emotionally. And it's like, come on, Jay. That's what I was being cornered with, is how can you show up entitled and extremely needy and still expect your wife to desire you and to want you? And that was an ego death for me, of recognizing I don't like myself. I have so much self-hatred inside of me. I am a tyrant to live with. And then at the same time, I'm wanting my kids and my wife to desire me. It was such a mind bender. And I think that's the power of relationships, is something in me really does need to die, not violently, but with a level of grief of, what have I been asking my family to have a front row seat to? And then again, that brings me into my relationship with my dad of how is it possible that all 3 of his sons at some level have received an inheritance of self-hatred that doesn't come from nowhere? So what is it in the Stringer lineage that really sets us up to hate ourselves and then also be intimidating to others? interesting. So that's a question that my marriage cornered me with to ask. And then in my grief, in my sorrow, in my repentance of bringing those to my wife, to my kids, and my tears, there's more love, there's more intimacy that's able to emerge through that process of integrity and death. And so that's the process, is none of this is easy. It's really difficult to desire your own death. And yet sometimes failure will do it. Other times you need to pursue some kind of critical period of transformation for something that you know in your soul is killing you. So there's I'll come back to what his name is. Liturgies of the Wild. He just wrote this book. I can't remember the author's name.
I read that this morning. And
did you? Martin Shaw. One of the things Martin Shaw says in that book, or maybe another book, is he says the soul is not above catastrophe to get your attention. And man, that hit me hard at some point in my marriage, where it was like, okay, so the catastrophe of an unwanted sexual behavior, the catastrophe of a divorce, the catastrophe of, a midlife crisis where you allow your life to be self-sabotaged. The soul is not above that to be able to get your attention. But you don't have to have a crisis or a profound failure to change. You just need to be able to listen to your life, to be able to study the conflicts, to be able to pay attention to, where does my soul feel dead? Where does my marriage feel tepid? Where do my relationships feel lonely? And to have integrity with trying to understand how it got to be that way and what is really needed to change. So it could be catastrophe, it could be crisis, but you can also begin to choose a critical period of growth. And that's the madness and the beauty of relationships, is that they are cornering us all the time to make changes.
Thank you for sharing all of that. Once again, the vulnerability of sharing your own story in that. And I'm struck by the fact, for a couple of reasons, it feels important to say as a kind of parentheses from simply our conversation, and I do want to get to the meaning desire. It's never too late to do the kind of work that you're talking about. I turned 62 in a few months, and I went with my wife and some dear friends to see Gabor Mate on Saturday night. And here's this physician, New York Times bestselling author, grandparents died in the Holocaust. His mother had to abandon him when he was 8 weeks old. And he told this story, this 82-year-old man who's just full of vibrancy. And he told the story, he said, 10 years ago when I was 72, like it was just this, it was funny. He was talking like when I was much, much younger, but he was 72. He was flying back from Philadelphia into his hometown of Vancouver, and his wife texted and said, "Do you still want me to pick you up at the airport?" And he said that triggered a response in him where he was immediately filled with rage and incredulity that she wouldn't pick him up at the airport and that she wasn't waiting. And he drove home in a taxi, was filled with rage the whole time, and then for 48 hours gave her the silent treatment. And I thought it was just going to be a cute story. And he said, what I realized after she said to me something like, "Are you done yet?" was that there was unresolved trauma in my life at 72 that he went to therapy, I think for the first time in his adult life, had to begin to deal with his compulsions and addictions, had to begin to deal with this deep, deep attachment wound of being abandoned at eight weeks. And then he said, "Pull up the slide, please," to the tech person. And up on the slide comes this painting. His wife, Ray, is a remarkable painter.
Yes.
And she painted a photograph of his mother standing in this spot, holding this 8-week baby, literally handing him off to a stranger because she couldn't feed him and care for him. And he said, it was when I turned 74, I believe, 2 years after this process of starting therapy, he went back to Budapest, where he was born, and stood on the exact square where his mother handed him off. They could tell through the photograph and the painting. And it was so moving.
So stunning.
And it was just the next day where that provoked something deep inside of me that literally felt like rage.
Hmm.
And I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but I felt so liberated by this 82-year-old man to say, do your work, even at this stage of life. So that's a process happening within me, but I know a lot of men that I work with and have worked with who are, post success, they've retired, they're in the last third of their life, and they're doing significant things, but there's work for them to do. And the
Yes.
invitation really is, if you enter into this death, that there's more life, more abundance, more joy, more connection, more intimacy, more pleasure, and even more meaning, to touch on, all of your 5 desires. So thank you. All of that provoked that inside of me.
Oh, it's so good. And I mean, not to move it too quickly into meaning, but you think about that story of like the meaning of this great psychiatrist who, at that moment, when he's going back to Budapest and he's at that square, I think if you cornered him with a threat to his life or death to say, like, do you want more meaning here, or do you want a #1 New York Times best-selling book next? I don't think that there's any doubt in his mind kind of what he's going to choose, that it wasn't about more success. It's about integration. It's about knowing kind of where he comes from. And
Yes.
it's our adult duty to tend to those wounds, not necessarily something like we can hope that a wife can draw that painting. We can hope that a good friend, but so much of what it means to be human is this recognition that a lot of this pain, a lot of this sorrow is something that I need to develop my own sight, my own soothing for. And so for him to make that journey and to connect with that 8-week-year-old inside of him, that's so much of just the beautiful, stunning work, is not necessarily to outsource it to someone else, but that he gets to stand there as an 82-year-old receiving an 8-week-year-old. And there's something just so beautiful about that process, but also so meaningful.
Yeah, it was really, really lovely. And all of that happened in front of 5,000 people. It was like being at a rock concert, hearing this 82-year-old man just talk for 2.5 hours.
Yes.
It was a little bit like how Mick Jagger at age 80, I saw him play at the Mile High Stadium, and he just keeps going and going. But I was so struck by the vitality inside of him, and I think that vitality was directly correlated to the being able to integrate the 8-week-old and to do that work. So you talk about meaning, and in this world of mastery, going back to the earlier part of the conversation, I think for many people, meaning often takes the form of, I have to do something significant. I have to somehow touch the world in a way where I'll be remembered. But you're talking about something that's far more relational and really about intimacy and connections.
Yeah, I think there's so much pressure these days to have to have a great legacy, to leave something profound behind, to be able to, in many ways, we're not made to know all the world's problems and all the injustices that exist, whether it's, dealing with people or agriculture or oil. I finished reading Everything is Tuberculosis. And great book on just 1 million people essentially dying of tuberculosis when we have a cure. It infuriates me, but you can read so many books along those lines. You read trauma books and you're like, why does sexual abuse have to happen? Why does tuberculosis have to happen? Why does racial injustice have to happen? Why does, all this have to happen to our food system and what's happening to animals? So we very quickly get overwhelmed by the injustices and needs of the world, and then paralysis begins to set in. So part of the question that we have to begin to ask is, where does our story come from? And we shouldn't feel the pressure to have to solve everything, to be the Messiah in all places. But if you begin to study your story, there will be themes that begin to emerge that are meaningful. So part of what I want to hold in tension for a little bit is, how do we develop a desire for meaning, but also how do we develop a desire for pleasure and vitality and play? And so, when you ask Viktor Frankl, man's search for meaning, he might say that that's what we need, is meaning. But then you ask someone like Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell would say, I don't think so much that, humanity is after meaning. I think we're after experiences of feeling fully alive. And I think that's the tension, is how do I feel alive as I go through life, but also how do I have a sense of what is meaningful and good? And so one of the categories that I work through is just how, what is play for people? So when, Eugene Peterson was talking about the notion of a Sabbath, one of the things he says is that the people of Israel needed a Sabbath because they essentially went 400 years without a vacation. And so that sense of, we need places in our life that we don't have to be good. We don't have to be there for other people. We don't have to kind of contribute in ways that feel disingenuous. We just get to be a human being. And so just that category of where do you play in your life? When we talk about some of the greats, the great pianists, we don't say that, Mozart, Beethoven, John Batiste, they're working and laboring at the piano. We say they play the piano. And so right. All of us need to kind of go back to where in our life do we play? Is that when we cook? Is that when we're doing landscaping? Is that when we are hosting people? Is that when we are playing a guitar? And so part of this invitation is, there's a lot of difficulties in our life. There's a lot of crucibles that we have to go through, but also, are we developing a desire for a more playful existence than the one that we have? So can talk about play for a little bit before we move to meaning, but I think play and feeling alive is just so central to having a good life.
It's interesting that you talked about landscaping. This is a dead serious thing. In our field, there's not a lot of closure. There's always loose ends. And so people talk about, I love gardening. And that's my wife's thing. I love pulling weeds. I never knew that I loved pulling weeds, but I've got my Home Depot 5-gallon bucket, little weeder, and to go out in the yard and just pull, but not just pull them, but to get the little weeder underneath so it just pops up and you get the entire thing. And then the lawn looks great. And I've spent probably the last 2 weeks doing that. And it just, I literally feel joy doing it.
Right.
But it's hard work. And so sometimes play is this idea of, no, I have to go do something that is fun and out. It can't be cooking because that's hard work, or it can't be pulling weeds because that's hard work. But it's something that it's more about that it's life-giving. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I love that image. I live in New York City right now, so I don't have a lawnmower. But one of the things that I loved living in Seattle was just getting out my old lawnmower, starting that thing up, and then just doing the lines and getting to see the impact of my life immediately. Because that's part of you and I being therapists, where it's we can be in someone's story for 6 months, years. And not to say that we don't see change, but we're often waiting. We're playing the long game with people's lives of this devastation of a forest fire to what new life begins to emerge months, years after that. It takes time. So I think for us as therapists to be able to like do an activity where I can see the immediate impact of my life, there's something so satisfying to that. So I did some of that upstate a bit too. I was just trying to clear some property, clear some weeds, and I could just be gone. Like I could tell my wife, like, I'll be back. And did not need water, did not need food. I could work for like 8-10 hours, just kind of like digging things, making my own trail we had kind of a invasive species. It's called burning bush at a property upstate. And so essentially just cut that burning bush down, mulched it. And then the poison, the invasive became the path. And I was like, oh, that's my work is,
Love
these
it.
invasive aspects of our life actually become the trail that we walk. So you're right. I didn't just want always to be outside. It's hard work, but there's something about dedicating life to some of that hard work that can eventually become somewhat playful and meaningful. So there's a region in our brain called the AMCC. It's the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. And that's one of the biggest discoveries in neuroscience in the last couple years. And what they found is that your AMCC is essentially like your will to live, is the way some neuroscientists are talking about it. But essentially, it grows the more that you do something that you don't want to do. So a lot of people, like sauna, and it's really difficult. But if you like it, your AMCC does not grow. You actually have to do something that you don't like. So the AMCC is a lot stronger. It's a lot bigger in athletes, in people who, have to move through a lot of resistance. And then it's a lot smaller in people that are obese or have more of a lazy lifestyle. It's a much smaller dimension of their life. So there are, I think, times and places where you have to intentionally choose something that is difficult. And I think therapy is a context for that. I think relational growth is a context for that. But also, that was part of my question to you earlier about music and songwriting is I think writing nonfiction therapy books is hard. When I've tried to write music and poetry, it's so much more difficult than anything I've ever tried to write. And so that sense of my AMCC really needs to grow in a creative way. I can be good. I can be useful to other people. I can kind of do that in my sleep. But the creative way of life, that's what's calling for me now in a life of meaning. So.
Well, you're in the right place to live in New York City for that. That feels to me like just
so much annoying levels of talent here.
Yeah, I know. So many distractions, but so much talent. And when I, having grown up Catholic and spent a fair amount of time in a monastery with my aunt who was a nun, when I go on a retreat, I like to go to New York City or to a city where I feel more contemplative when I'm in an urban setting.
Huh. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I want acreage, no people.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, will you finish with, in meaning, you talk about 3 things to remember, village, life through death, which we touched on, and then remembering your beauty. Can you just give a summary of those?
Yeah, so life through death we covered. The role of community is, this is taken some from Francis Weller, but many others have spoken to this in our day and age too, where, part of the problem that we're running into with intimacy or friendship is that we used to rely on a whole community, a whole village, a whole tribe to be able to give us some level of identity formation, a rite of passage, intimacy, connection, and meaning in our life. But now we often over-index into a particular romantic relationship or our career. And so that's what I find a lot in my clients is that they begin to bring all of their needs for validation, all their needs for meaning into their career. And they over-index in that career. And then inevitably their marriage implodes or their friendships begin to erode. Or you might have other people that they just love cozy relationships and they're all about connection. They're all about kind of bringing their needs, their desires to their good friends and to their significant other. And yet at the end of the day, it's like there's something about this relationship that begins to feel enmeshed because there's no outside influence that's summoning them to create, to kind of move beyond. And so in the past, we used to have, a village that would help us to understand who we are. This is the family history that we come from. Here's the rite of passage that will form you into being a man or a woman. And then also here is your community that you can bring your difficulties to, that you can bring your sense of love and commitment to, and then you find fulfillment through kind of mutual connection and love for one another. We live in the absence of a lot of that. So we over-index in careers, in relationships, in our own self-sabotage, be able to avoid something of that kind of mutual reliance on other people. So we need a village. And then that third category that I'm working is, what does it mean for us to remember our own beauty? And the complexity is that most of us have an inner voice that already tells us that we're not beautiful, that we look at how much we ate last night. We look at something of, our own difficulties in life, meaning I didn't make enough money this year, don't have enough friends. Most of us have irrefutable evidence that surrounds us that convinces us that we are not beloved, that we are not beautiful. And yet I think part of the parable of the talents, that God has given us these desires, these talents. God has given us his son. We are born in the image of God. Like, there is so much beauty inside of us that I don't think many people are waking up to. But the more that we understand our beauty, I think the more that we protect it, the more that we're able to see it in other people as well. So I think this is part of, if I could just shake people in a very kind way, that's what I would want to do, is I would want to wake people up, shake people to the recognition of how beautiful, how stunning they are.
The book is Desire, and it's available everywhere fine books are sold. And Jay Stringer, thank you so much for another great conversation, helping us to unpack this absolutely crucial aspect of our lives.
Oh, Michael, thank you for having me. I really, enjoyed our first conversation. Also really enjoyed seeing you with your Home Depot bucket and your guitar. And again, like, whether it's the Restoring the Soul podcast or the weekend that you have or the guitar, like, desire is central to all the beauty and goodness that you bring to your family, to your life, to the men and women that you serve. So I think, just very struck by that again, that desire is not something that will inevitably bring you into something of self-sabotage or selfishness. Like, your desires are creating a feast for a lot of people. So thank you for bringing us into some of your desires as well.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome. I received that. So everybody listening, just remember this, that on your darkest day or your longest night, love has you. Take care, everybody.
So we've wrapped up another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. In fact, the heart of what we have done for nearly 20 years is intensive counseling. When you can't wait months or years to get out of the rut you're in, our intensive counseling programs in Colorado allow you to experience deep change in half-day blocks over 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.